One of the things I find most interesting about the nature of storytelling is the art of adaptation. When people hear that word, they typically think about what comic book stories are going to be adapted into movies, but that's just one way of looking at it. I'd argue that it's one of the oldest tricks in the book because different cultures have different takes on similar subject matter. The most obvious is Akira Kurosawa's The Seventh Samurai being adapted by screenwriter William Roberts and director John Sturges into The Magnificent Seven. As stories move into different cultures in different parts of the world, they're adapted and recontextualized into the culture that tells them. Adaptation has been around for as long as humanity has been telling stories. Which brings us to fairy tales. A lot of them started as European folktales before being cleaned up and sold to children, with Disney being the main practitioner of this. A trend I've noticed in the last decade or so is the application of dark fantasy to a lot of fantasy stories as well. I don't mind this, because dark fantasy fucking rules. I'm a huge Dragon Age fan, and while they've certainly gotten brightened up as time went on, that underlying current of horror is still there whenever the deep roads pop up in the games not named Dragon Age Origins, and that horror gets cranked up to 11 when you eventually go to the deep roads in Dragon Age Origins. But this time, we're going to be taking a look at a game that takes a lot of these darker takes on fairy tales, which also serves as an incredibly smart refining of a developer's previous work. This week, for the inaugural Spooktober, we're going to be looking at Ravenswatch. Look, I know it's a roguelike and that's primarily my shtick, but it's horror-themed, so it counts! As I was saying before all of that, Ravenswatch is a dark fantasy horror-themed action roguelike developed by Passtech Games. For those not in the roguelike pits like I am, they are the developers behind the much-acclaimed Curse of the Dead Gods, which is a game that I personally really enjoyed, up there with Hades and Dead Cells as far as I'm concerned. But it was also distinguished by being hard as fuck, between the curse mechanic that added a dangerous sense of risk and reward, and the general high difficulty to combat encounters. Ravenswatch still has those to an extent, but goes in a vastly different direction in terms of structure. The approach that Curse of the Dead Gods took was in the form of a map screen ripped straight out of Slay the Spire as a means of illustrating that you were delving deeper into a cursed temple. Ravenswatch is instead split up into 3 separate chapters. You go from these ruined fields infested with monsters to a ruined beach infested with monsters, to the 3rd chapter being the corrupted island of Avalon. You know, the magical island where Excalibur was forged, and in some interpretations where Arthur was brought to recover following being gravely wounded by Mordred in the Battle of Camelon, which is a bit of an escalation, but it fits with the tone. Speaking of tone, and more broadly the story, Ravenswatch is set in the fantastical land of Reverie. Here, all of the stories that we frequently hear about in our youths that across the world inhabit this land, and one day they are beset by nightmares, a combination of corruption and monsters coming from an unknown source that has taken the land in its grip. The only thing standing between the nightmares and complete domination is the Ravenswatch, a group of heroes backed by the dream-controlling Sandman and a mysterious Raven God. Their primary motivation is to stop the spread of the nightmares and regain what they each lost along the way. It's a decent setup and justification for the events of the game to take place. It's your standard group of heroes band together to save the world type story, and I like it. They're all different characters from different stories and mythologies. You've got Scarlet, a rogue afflicted with lycanthropy who represents both Little Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf. You've also got Beowulf, accompanied by a dragon whelp that he's honor-bound to race after killing its mother in the Vile Grendel, the Snow Queen Nis, whose healing touch was turned into one of ice, following her healing powers being corrupted by the nightmares, and the Pied Piper Franz, whose music was also nightmare corrupted and can control rats as a result. And those are just the heroes that got added in the early access launch. They're accompanied by the mermaid Melusine, who's more so themed after a siren in Greek mythology, which I find very interesting. Geppetto, the wood carver and inventor who seeks to avenge the loss of his son Pinocchio with mechanical efficiency. Aladdin, a former thief and rogue who seeks to release his beloved from the genie's lamp that he carries with him. The newest hero, Camilla the Vampire Queen, who seeks to regain her kingdom and lost lover. And my personal favorite, Sun Wukong, the Monkey King and Heaven's Equal, who seeks to regain his stolen immortality. Overall, that's 9 heroes in total, with more possibly on the way. I don't actually know that for sure, but I hope so, because I think it would be fucking sick if you could play as Mordred, because come on, Avalon's the 3rd chapter, and there's a lot of stuff that you can play with there. You could also add any from a litany of Greek heroes. Odysseus and Perseus will be rad as fuck in particular. The sky is the limit is what I'm saying. One thing that I do appreciate is how, as you increase a hero's rank, you'll unlock more and more of their backstory. These are some of my favorite writing in the entire game and are all done in varying styles. Beowulf is in the stylings of an old English poem, like the actual Beowulf poem. Scarlet is written like a survival horror apocalyptic log. And I love this because some are more like personal journal entries, some are recordings of each character's exploits, etc. And my personal favorite is that Sun Wukong's diary entries are just him endlessly shit-talking the nightmares about how if he had his immortality, he'd take care of this entire thing in a day. Which is fairly in line with how I remember him being in Journey to the West. I can't say for sure, it's been like a decade since I last read it at least. These journal entries go a long way to making these characters feel fleshed out and really goddamn cool. What also makes these characters really goddamn cool is the way they play. Ravenswatch's gameplay is of the action RPG variety for its roguelike structure, much like Curse of the Dead Gods before it. But the difference is in the actual RPG mechanics that were incorporated this time around. Curse of the Dead Gods was, for the most part, an isometric action game with dodge rolling and parrying and stamina management, all of which had to be juggled in order to make it to the end of the runs with enough resources and low enough corruption to keep them getting fucked over. Ravenswatch, though? It's a straight-up action RPG with experience and shit. The main way that the game unfolds is that you have roughly 4 to 5 in-game days, which is roughly 20 minutes in real time, to get yourself as powerful as possible to fight the Master Nightmare located in a random place on the map. You can opt to fight it early for a score bonus, but I strongly advise against that. You will not be strong enough to do it. And the way you get strong is by going around and finding specific things marked on your map. Dreamstones for dream shards that let you buy things, upgrades to your max HP, increases to your damage, armor, crit chance, crit damage, all that good stuff. You can also find nightmare pods that you can clear out to remove 20% of the boss's health. I strongly encourage that. Chests that give you items that augment your build, and more. There's a lot of stuff here on the passive front that I didn't even get into the traits that you get on level up. But I need to talk about the Ravenswatch members' mechanics first before I do that. Each of the 9 characters in Ravenswatch all have their own unique spins on the basic gameplay and control setup. You have a trait/passive that can be activated on some characters, a basic attack, a power attack, a special attack, a defensive ability, and an ultimate attack. Some characters are even affected by the day-night cycle, ranging from having different bonuses, like Camilla having increased crit chances at night, to the Pied Piper's abilities working differently depending on the time of day to build up rats to throw at enemies, to something as radically different as Scarlet, basically swapping between being a speedy, evasive rogue in the daytime and being a lumbering but powerful werewolf at night. It's some incredibly wild shit. And there's others, such as the Ice Queen stacking out frost on enemies with her abilities to detonate with her trait, Aladdin being mobile as fuck with twin scimitars and using his trait to access his lamp and give himself one of his 3 wishes. Beowulf is a standard brawler that gets cracked wide open when he uses his trait to empower his abilities with dragonfire and unleashing his whelp to fly around and unleash fiery hell. Geppetto can call out small automatons, and his abilities are all focused on empowering and repositioning them. Melusine and Sun Wukong are stance characters, with the former entering a singing stance that controls a wisp that she throws out, controls tidal waves, and can dive underwater for quick saves. And the latter has a strength stance for massive damage at the cost of being squishy as hell, and a defensive stance that gives him immense lifesteal at the cost of lower damage. All of these characters are incredibly fun to play as, but Sun Wukong and Beowulf are my go-tos, if the footage being the majority of them is anything to go by. Mainly because Sun Wukong I've played more than any of the other characters because I love that dude, and Beowulf being the one that got me the furthest in a run. I'm talking like, I almost got to the final boss of Avalon. There's also the passives that you get from leveling up that are needed to get your build online. You only can take 10 at a time on a given run, but this is compensated by the fact that they're all ridiculously powerful. The small stuff is passive number increases, sure, I can live with that. But the capital B big stuff can be the centerpieces of entire builds, define runs, and even change the way your basic abilities work. The two most prominent examples has to be Beowulf's Blademaster passive that makes it so empowering your basic abilities makes your next 3 basic attacks do increased damage on top of a passive attack speed increase, Bladestorm giving his spin 2 extra spins, and his capstone being when you pop your ultimate that sends your dragon flag around and burning shit, you light yourself on fire and all of your abilities are automatically empowered because you lose that function otherwise when the dragon is out. The other is Sun Wukong getting extensions to his basic attack combo, his Nimbus being able to bounce off of more targets, his counter becoming AoE damage when he uses it, his ultimate being able to send out an army of clone monkeys getting more clones, or my personal favorite, his transfiguration potion that he uses to mimic his fabled 72 transformations, making it so that whichever hero you turn into has virtually no cooldown on their abilities when you transform into them. Oh yeah. Have fun with that shit. I'm not joking when I say that the build crafting in this game is some ridiculous bullshit. And that's not even getting into how magical objects can augment your build further, with legendary items like Excalibur and the Holy Grail giving you massive bonuses, and the cursed items for when you want to get a little spicy. Overall, the build crafting is going to be a thing that keeps the more theory-minded roguelike players amongst us coming back for the foreseeable future. Oh, one more thing. You also only get 6 revives over the course of an entire run. Waste all of them, and it's game over. Can't believe I almost forgot about that part. That seems pretty important. Ravenswatch also looks and sounds super cool. Its dark fantasy take on a lot of the characters leads to some interesting character designs with neat details. Chief among them being Beowulf's burnt arm as a result of the dragon whelp just existing on that part of his body. The enemies and monsters all look suitably horrifying because the artists at Passtech Games are still the same artists behind Curse of the Dead Gods looking as fucked up as that game was. And you saw the footage earlier in the video, that game was super fucked up looking in the best way. It's also incredibly French, mainly in the sense that Passtech themselves are a French studio, so naturally a lot of that is just gonna bleed over, with more than a few of the heroes speaking with thick French accents, Scarlet and Melisande chief among them. The music is also really fucking good, with the combat theme sounding very reminiscent of the Witcher games, in the best way. Ravenswatch, after having spent the better part of a year in early access, can be summed up by this Breaking Bad quote I use frequently despite having never seen the show. Someone cooked here. And I'm talking great fucking chef type cooking. Everything between the structure, the playable characters, the systems that support some pretty wild builds are all fantastic. This is a game that if you're into roguelikes like I am, but are more selective, you should at least consider giving this a try. While Ravenswatch might be a bit dark and gloomy, its final release was something of a fairy tale ending for Passtech, and I could not be happier. Stay tuned for next week when things get decidedly more nautical on the channel for Spooktober. Safe tidings and Halloween!